It was September 14th, 2014, deep in the misty, shadowy woods of Tennessee. A bow hunter named Shane Barkley climbed into his favorite tree stand, just as he'd done countless times before. But on this particular day, Shane would come face to face with something so terrifying, so unexplainable, that it would shatter everything he thought he knew about the wilderness and life itself. What happened to Shane that day didn't just scare him, it changed him forever. It was supposed to be a day like any other for Shane Barkley. His plan was to spend a peaceful morning bow hunting in his favorite spot deep in the Tennessee woods. Shane had been hunting this area for years, a secluded, mist-filled depression hidden within a valley, nestled between two modest hills. It was the kind of place that made you feel completely cut off from the world. For Shane, this wasn't just another hunting spot. It was his sanctuary. Quiet, reliable, safe. But after what he experienced that morning, Shane would dare step foot there again. The day started early before sunrise. His truck rumbled down a dirt road cutting through the dense woods. The radio was off. He preferred silence, letting the anticipation of the hunt settle in. After parking at the edge of a narrow trailhead, Shane grabbed his gear, bow, arrows, and a small backpack, and set off on foot. The air was cool, damp with the kind of heavy fog that clings to the ground and swirls around your boots as you walk. His flashlight beam cut through the mist, revealing the faint outline of the trail ahead. It was a half-mile hike to his stand, but he didn't mind. He knew every twist and turn of this path by heart. As he moved deeper into the woods, the canopy above grew thicker, blotting out the pre-dawn light. The world around him became eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic crunch of leaves under his boots and the occasional rustle of branches in the breeze. To anyone else, this might feel unsettling. But for Shane, it was perfect. By the time he reached his tree stand, the forest was still cloaked in mist. This particular spot was a depression within a larger valley, a natural bowl-shaped clearing surrounded by thick, layered brush that climbed up the sides of the hills. The vegetation was so dense that hunting from the ground would have been impossible. The only way to see anything was from above. That's why Shane had chosen this spot. His stand, perched 25 feet up in a sturdy tree, offered a clear view of the narrow game trail below. A trail well worn by deer and other animals over the years. It was the perfect vantage point. He climbed the metal pegs he'd installed into the tree trunk, his boots tapping lightly against the steel as he ascended. Once he reached the platform, he settled in, his bow resting across his lap. The view from up there was surreal. The tops of bushes and trees stretched out like a sea of greens and greys, their edges vanishing into the fog. It was quiet and peaceful. But then he heard something strange, something that caught him off guard. An owl. Or at least, that's what it sounded like. Shane didn't think much of it at first. Owls were common in these parts, especially in the early morning hours. But then, he heard another call. And another. And another. The calls were coming from directly ahead of him, deep in the mist. They started as soft, spaced-out hoots, but quickly became more frequent, almost frantic. Then came the screeches, high-pitched, piercing sounds that echoed off the trees like something out of a nightmare. Shane froze. It wasn't the noise itself that unsettled him. It was the pattern. As a seasoned hunter, Shane knew the rhythms of the woods. He'd heard countless owls over the years, their calls rising and falling naturally, scattered across the forest. But these were different. Too many calls, too close together, and all coming from one area. Something wasn't right, but something about the owl calls felt off. A shiver ran down Shane's spine. He scanned the foggy trail ahead, his eyes darting between the shifting shadows. The calls continued, relentless and chaotic, like some kind of eerie symphony. His pulse quickened, and for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. He tightened his grip on his bow, wishing he'd brought a gun instead. The thought of climbing down crossed his mind, but the idea of being on the ground, exposed, felt worse. So he stayed put. And then it happened. Shane felt it before he saw it. A firm grip closed around the heel of his left boot. It didn't make sense. He was 20 to 25 feet in the air. Nothing, no one, should have been able to reach him. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He jolted violently, almost toppling out of the tree stand. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the eerie silence of the forest. And then, trembling, Shane turned his head downward, and that's when he saw it. A face stared back at him, a sight his mind struggled to fully grasp. It was massive, easily twice the size of a man's head, with features that seemed like a blend of gorilla and human. Its brow was heavy, jutting forward over eyes that gleamed a faint, unsettling amber in the dim light. The nose was broad and flat, but the mouth, with its slightly upturned corners, seemed too human in its expression, a grimace that could have been a smile or a warning. Long, greyish-white hair framed its face, hanging in tangled strands that almost seemed to melt into the mist around it. The skin, dark grey and textured like aged leather, looked as if it had been weathered by countless years in the elements. But its eyes were the most terrifying part. They were intelligent, not animalistic or primal, but sharp, calculating, and aware. The creature wasn't just looking at Shane, it was studying him. And then Shane noticed the hand. It was enormous, massive, a combination of a human hand and an ape's paw. The fingers were thick, almost tree-like, and ended in blunt, dark nails that looked capable of tearing through anything in their path. The texture of its skin was cracked and ridged, like the bark of an ancient tree. This monstrous hand was wrapped around his boot, its grip firm yet oddly gentle. Shane's eyes followed the arm, an impossibly long, muscular appendage, easily 5 to 6 feet in length, covered in the same coarse, greyish-white hair. The arm extended up, stretching effortlessly to reach him 20+ feet above the ground. The creature itself was immense, at least 15 feet tall, maybe more, he recalled through the haze of terror. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, easily spanning 3 times the width of the narrow game trail it stood on. The chest, partially visible through its thick hair, rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths. Every inch of it seemed built for power, its proportions almost surreal in their size. They stayed locked in that moment, hunter and hunted. Neither moved. Neither blinked. And then, just as suddenly as it had grabbed him, the creature let go. Its massive hand released Shane's boot with deliberate gentleness, almost as if it wanted to say, "I could have pulled you down if I wanted to." But it didn't. Shane's eyes followed it as it turned and began walking down the trail. Its back was to him now, revealing its full size and enormity. The creature's shoulders moved like a shifting wall of muscle, tapering down to arms so long they nearly brushed the ground as it walked. Its gait was deliberate, unhurried. Every step was measured, purposeful. The long hair that covered its body shifted with its movement, revealing glimpses of the rough, dark skin beneath. Shane's mind raced to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't just an animal. This wasn't just a predator. This was something else. Each step sent vibrations through the forest floor, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to grow quieter as it disappeared into the mist. But what lingered most in Shane's mind was its face. Its dark grey skin bore an almost smirking expression. He couldn't help but think, was this thing mocking him? Or was it playing with him? For 2 hours, Shane remained frozen in his stand, paralyzed not just by fear, but by an overwhelming sense of disconnection. It wasn't just shock. This was something deeper, something physiological. He later described the sensation as being under anesthetic, as if sedation had taken hold of his body and mind. Time became elastic, stretching and distorting in ways that didn't make sense. His thoughts were sluggish, coming in fragmented bursts that evaporated as quickly as they formed. Even his memories of the creature, the sheer size, the eerie intelligence in its gaze, felt distant, like a half-remembered dream slipping through his grasp. When he finally summoned the courage to climb down, the act itself felt unreal. His movements were deliberate, but slow, as if he were wading through molasses. Each step down the tree stand ladder seemed to take an eternity, the world around him muted and distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was moving in slow motion, disconnected from the passage of time. By the time his boots hit the forest floor, his legs felt weak, foreign, like they didn't belong to him. He sat under the tree for what felt like hours, staring blankly down the trail where the creature had disappeared. The dense fog, the eerie quiet, the oppressive atmosphere, they all pressed down on him, compounding his daze. When Shane finally reached his car, it was nearly noon, many hours after the encounter. The hike back stretched endlessly in his mind, punctuated by flashes of the creature's face, its hand, its sheer, impossible size. He drove home in silence, his hands trembling on the wheel. The woods blurred past his window, their once familiar contours now foreign and menacing. His mind was a foggy haze, replaying the encounter on a loop, but offering no answers. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Shane couldn't even remember the drive. He sat in his car for a long time, staring ahead, unable to think or speak. Whatever had happened to him in those woods, it had taken more than his composure. It had taken a part of his reality. For the next week, Shane didn't leave his house. He called in sick to work, unable to shake the lingering fear and the surreal haze that had consumed him. Months later, curiosity drove him back to the site. Standing beneath the tree stand, he tried to piece together what had happened. Looking up, he traced the distance between where he sat and where the creature's hand had reached. It didn't make sense. Its size, its intelligence, its presence, it was all beyond explanation. Shane's encounter left him with more questions than answers. Why didn't the creature harm him? Was it trying to intimidate him? Or was it simply curious? Whatever the case, Shane knew one thing for certain. That forest, that spot, was no longer his sanctuary. It belonged to something else.